I'm Miss Elizabeth, and this is My Teacher is an Alien, Part 5. Stacy and Mike did a good job, didn't they? Said Peter when we got together on the playground at recess. What are you talking about? I asked. Stacy and Mike. Didn't you think that fight they put on was pretty good? The fight they put on? I asked. Peter sounded impatient. Stacy and Mike were afraid Broxton will decide one of them is the best kid in the class and then try to kidnap whichever one he chooses. So they decided to fake a fight. Mess up their reputations a little. All of a sudden, everything became clear. That's why Duncan brought Mr. Smith an apple this morning, I said. Peter giggled. Pathetic, isn't it? But it might work. Right now, Duncan's a sure pick for the worst kid in the class. But if he works really hard, he might actually manage to pull himself off the bottom of the list. Still, since he knows that no matter what he does, he's never going to push himself into the most average category, if he can improve at all, he's probably safe. The problem is he's been so bad all year that it's going to take a major effort to get out of that bottom spot. Peter paused and then added, I intend to have some fun with him over the next 3 days. 3 days. That was all the time we had before Broxham was scheduled to kidnap 5 of us into space. That's not very nice, I started to say. But then I remembered the way Duncan had tormented Peter for the last 6 years. I decided I couldn't blame Peter if he wanted to get a little of his own back while he could. Any decision to be a nice guy about this was going to have to come from inside himself. I decided to change the subject. Tell me, I asked, just how did they know about all of this? I told them, said Peter. And they believed you? Actually, it made sense. If they were going to believe anyone, it would be Peter. He had a reputation as being the most honest kid in the class, which was one of his problems. He didn't know how to tell the kind of little white lies that keep people from getting mad at you. But I doubted that even his reputation for honesty would convince people that this story was true. Peter smiled. Actually, you're the reason anyone believed me. It started with Stacy. She just didn't believe you'd really fainted, or if you had, that you would have tried to grab the teacher's ear on the way down. So she knew something was going on. Later, she cornered me on the playground and demanded to know what you were up to. Why you? I asked. Peter blushed. You're going to hate this, he said. There's a rumor going around that you're my girlfriend because we've been spending so much time talking on the playground. Yuck! I yelled. Yuck, yuck, yuck! Suddenly I realized what I'd just done. Don't take that personally, I said. I won't, since I feel the same way. Hey, I thought. What do you mean you feel the same way? But we didn't have time to work this out right now. Anyway, said Peter, Stacy was convinced I must know what was going on, and since I did, I told her. The whole story? I gasped. Peter nodded. She didn't believe me at first, of course, but when she talked to you on Saturday and you told her there was nothing actually wrong with you, she figured it must be true. He laughed. That was all it took. By Saturday afternoon, the phone lines were humming all over Kennettuck Falls. How come you know all of this? I asked. How come no one asked me? Peter shrugged. Well, that's not the way rumors work. People never check with the source. They always ask someone else. Don't ask me why, but it's true. Lots of stupid things are true. Anyway, Stacy told Mike, and Mike told somebody else, and that was it. And it's just the kind of story that travels fast. And they all believe it? I asked. Peter shook his head. I don't think so, at least not yet. Except for Duncan. Yeah, he's so dim he'll believe anything. Especially if Stacy and Mike believe it. He thinks they know everything. That's why he hates them so much. I see, I said. Though some of this was coming a little too fast for me. Well, do you suppose if enough of us start to believe it, the adults will pay any attention to us? Peter looked as if I had just suggested Mickey Mouse was likely to get elected the next president of the United States. Get real, Susan, he said. They'll say it's just another crazy kid rumor. Do you remember last year when half the people in the school were convinced that the president was coming to Kennetock Falls to make a speech? I nodded. I had almost believed it myself. Half because so many of my friends did, and half because I wanted it to be true. I also remember how my father had laughed when he heard about it. Just because 1,000 idiots believe something, that doesn't make it true, he had said. Which was true, I guess, but it certainly didn't help us now. That was when Peter decided to complicate things with a new problem. What are you going to do about this yourself? He asked. What do you mean? Well, since one of the things on Broxham's shopping list is the best kid in the class, if we can't unmask him, you've got a good chance of being picked yourself. Oh, that was the best laugh I'd had in days. You're nuts, I said. There's no way I could be picked for the top kid in the class. There is too. It all depends on how he's making his choice. The way I see it, there are 4 of us that might be considered best in the class. Stacy, Mike, you, and me. You're nuts, I said again. Listen to me. Stacy and Mike are your basic perfect students. But they just did a good job of taking themselves out of the running. Though to tell you the truth, I don't think Broxham would have chosen either of those anyway. They're real bright, but they don't think that much. They believe everything the teacher tells them. I'm sure Broxham is bright enough to know that doesn't make a great student. He paused. And then there's me, he said. I'm real bright, but I'm not motivated. I'm not very social. You know how that goes. Peter's a good student, but he's not very well rounded. I hear it every year. That leaves you, Susan. You get good grades. You get along with everyone. You're in all kinds of activities. Let's face it, you may not be the best in any one thing, but when you look at everything together, you make a pretty good pick for top of the class. I stared at him in horror. You're not kidding, are you? He shook his head. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been worried that Broxham might want me for one of the average slots. It never even crossed my mind that I could be considered the top student in the class. Peter, what am I going to do? I wailed. Peter shrugged his skinny shoulders. Don't worry, I've got a plan. I thought he meant the camera. He didn't, but I didn't know that then. The plan he actually meant was so weird I would never have thought of it. I took a deep breath and tried to settle down. I'm glad you mentioned that, I said, referring to the camera. I think I figured out the best time for me to get back into Broxham's house. You mean us, said Peter. I shook my head. I mean me, I said. I'm going to do it tomorrow morning during my music lesson. That way Mr. Smith won't suspect anything when I leave the room. I figure if I use my bike, I can make it to his house and back before I'm really missed. I'll get in trouble later, but at least I'll have the proof we need. You're not going alone, said Peter. Yes, I am, I said. If we both take off, it's going to look suspicious, especially considering the amount of time we've been spending together lately. Maybe suspicious enough that Broxham will pretend he's sick just so he can check up on us. We don't want him walking in on us while we're taking the photographs. I doubt we could manage to sneak out of his house without getting caught a second time, especially if he's actually looking for us. Then I should go instead, said Peter. You might not have enough time. I'll just skip school altogether. How can you do that? I asked. Peter sighed. I keep telling you it doesn't matter what what I do. As long as I don't get in trouble with the law, no one cares. Well, Peter, that's not a very nice way to talk, especially about your parents. I don't have parents, he snapped. I have a parent, period. And he doesn't care what I do, as long as I don't get in trouble. I felt stupid. Here I'd known this kid for 6 years, and I didn't even know he only had one parent. All right, I said, we'll go together. Why don't I just go alone? Said Peter. I shook my head. I got this whole thing started. It's my job. Actually, I wasn't really feeling all that noble about my job. I wanted to see Miss Schwartz again to make sure she was okay. Peter shrugged. You're the one who's going to land in the hot water. If that's the way you want to do it, it's okay with me. Then it was time to go back inside. Even though the major weirdness was over for the day, you could sense a nervous energy in the classroom. The kids didn't really believe the rumor about Mr. Smith being an alien. At least not yet, but after the little show Stacy and Mike had put on, they were starting to take things pretty seriously. It would have been funny if it wasn't so scary. The next morning, I rode my bike to school, carrying my piccolo and camera in my backpack. As I was putting the lock on my front wheel, Duncan Dougal came sliding up to me and said, "If you and Peter are pulling some kind of a joke on me, I'm going to turn you into peanut butter." Strange as it may seem, Duncan's threat made me feel better. At least I knew there were some things in the world that I could still count on. "It's no joke, Duncan," I said, drawing a cross over my heart with my fingers. He looked at me suspiciously, and then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Now, what are we going to do about it?" Now that was something I hadn't expected. An offer of help from Duncan Dugan. Think quick, I told myself. This may not happen again for another century. I looked at Duncan. "How would you feel about skipping school today?" He grinned, showing the big gap between his front teeth. "I love skipping school," he said. He wasn't telling me something I didn't already know. One of the things that made it possible to survive having Duncan in our class was the fact that he was out of school so often. We all knew his older brother wrote his excuses for him, but none of us were about to tell. We weren't crazy enough to do something that would put Duncan in our classroom any more often than necessary. Besides, if one of us told and Duncan found out who did it, he would massacre that person. But it might be useful to have him along if I could be sure of one thing. "Can you go someplace with Peter without picking on him?" I asked. "Sure," said Duncan. "I like Peter." I looked at him. To my astonishment, he looked like he really meant it. I shook my head. What can you say to someone like that? "All right," I said. "You go do whatever it is you do when you skip school. I'm going to sneak out of the building at 9:15. I want you to meet me at the corner of Pike and Parker. You'll need a bike." I thought about telling him not to steal it, but then I decided that might seem too insulting. "So where are we going?" Duncan asked. I looked him right in the eye and said, "Peter and I are going to break into Mr. Smith's house and take pictures of the force field where he's holding Miss Schwartz prisoner. I want you to stand outside and be our lookout, in case Mr. Smith gets wise and comes back to stop us." I hesitated and then added, "I hope you won't mind facing an alien death ray." I suppose that was a rotten thing to say, but the look on Duncan's face made it worth it. I was so nervous that I didn't even look at Mr. Smith when it was time for me to leave for my lesson. "Forgive me, Mr. Banwick," I thought as I headed away from his room towards the side door. Peeking out to make sure there was no one around, I sprinted to my bike, unlocked it, and headed out of the schoolyard as fast as I could. Duncan was waiting at the corner of Pine and Parker, sitting on a blue 5-speed. "Follow me," I said, and kept riding for the edge of town. I checked my watch. It had been 12 minutes since I left class. If I could make it back just as fast, that would give me 16 minutes to take the pictures. Peter was waiting in front of the hedge at Broxham's house. I could see his smile quickly turn to a frown when he saw who was with me. His pale face turned even paler as we drew up. "What's he doing here?" Peter demanded. I was impressed. It took a lot of nerve for Peter to say that in front of Duncan. To my surprise, it was Duncan who tried to make peace. "I just came to help," he said. He did say it kind of belligerently, but he was holding up his hands with the palms out to show that he meant peace. "He's going to be our lookout," I added, hoping that Peter would see the wisdom of this. He hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Okay, I guess you can stay." Duncan looked as pleased as a naughty puppy who's been let back in the house. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Stand right there," I said, indicating a spot just inside the hedge where he could have a good view of the sidewalk. "If you see Mr. Smith coming, run up on the porch and pound on the door. Run up on the porch and pound on the door to give us a warning. Then run for your life." Duncan nodded seriously and took his place. I looked at Peter. He gave me a nod and we headed for the back of the house. To my relief, the broken lock was still where Peter had jammed it back into place after our last adventure here. I figured that as a temporary tenant, Broxham probably wouldn't have kept a close eye on things. It was nice to find out that I had been right. We opened the door and headed back into the alien's lair. I felt a little more at ease this time. After all, we could be pretty sure that Broxham would stay at school. We knew exactly where we were going, and we had a lookout to keep us from being surprised. How could anything go wrong? The answer to that question was even worse than I expected. For the first few minutes, everything went as smooth as it could. We made it out of the cellar and into the attic with time to spare. Nothing had changed. The column of blue light was still there, and poor Miss Schwartz was still trapped right in the middle of it. I rushed over and placed my hands against the force field. Almost instantly, I could hear Miss Schwartz's voice in my head. "Hello, Susan. What are you doing here?" "We came to take some pictures of you so that we can prove what's going on," I thought back at her. Her reply scared me. "Weren't you just here a few minutes ago?" she asked. She sounded confused. I bit my lip. Was she all right? Of course, since the thought was about her, Miss Schwartz picked it up. "I'm not sure," she responded. "It's getting so very hard to think in here." She paused for a moment and then asked, "What day is this?" "It's Tuesday," I thought. "Tuesday, the 24th of May. Her reaction almost knocked me over. "You must do something," she thought desperately. "It's only 2 days until Broxham is planning his pickup, Susan. You have to do something." I know, I replied. Her fear was coming through as clearly as her thoughts, and it was making me afraid, too. Our conversation was interrupted by Peter. "Susan, we can't just stand here and chat. We've got to get those pictures taken." He was right, of course. "Hang on, Miss Schwartz," I thought. "We'll get you out of here somehow." Peter had already started flashing. "That's good," he said. "Let me get a couple more of you standing next to her. Then move away from the force field so I can get some more of Miss Schwartz by herself." I was glad Peter was there. I might have gotten so wound up talking to Miss Schwartz that I wouldn't have taken the pictures in time to get back to school. But he was working fast. In a few minutes, he had used up almost the whole roll of film, taking some pictures with flashes and some pictures without, working from all different angles. I helped, and we did everything we could think of to make sure we got at least one good shot. We were just trying to figure out the last angle when we heard a terrible scream from downstairs. "Oh!" A couldn't make any sense of the words, but I recognized the voice. It belonged to Duncan Dougal. And we'll see what trouble Duncan has gotten into in the next part.